The much awaited moment has arrived, and we have Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak with us for her valedictory address. As it is rightly said, knowledge has a beginning but no end. The upcoming session will help us explore new avenues of knowledge. We all are looking forward to some lively dialogue and discussion, so stimulating for the mind and the intellect. I now call upon the chairs for this session, Professor Nishad Zaidi. Professor Nishad Zaidi is Professor and Head, Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Her research interests include post-colonial writings, Indian literature in English translation, comparative literature and women's writing. A scholar, critic, and translator, she has 10 books and a number of published papers to her credit. She has co-edited Story is a Vagabond, Fiction, Essays, and Drama by Intizar Hussain. Guest edited 2 special issues of the review journal, The Book Review. Her translation of Day and Dastan is her most recent publication. I now move on to the next chair of this session, Professor Hans Harder. He is Professor of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures at the South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University, Germany. His research interests are modern literatures in South Asia, particularly Bengali, religious movements, and intellectual history. He is the author of Sufism and Saint Veneration in Bangladesh, published by Routledge in 2011, and other books, and has co-edited Asian Punches, A Transcultural Affair, published by Springer 2013, and Literary Sentiments in the Vernacular, published by Special Issue of South Asia, Journal for South Asian Studies in 2020. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you, Meenakshi. Thank you, Kashish. It's indeed an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce none other but Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak. The range and reach of her writings can hardly be summed up in few words. As we all know, she is the University Professor of English at Columbia University and a founding member and director of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Professor Spivak did her BA in English first class honors from Presidency College, Calcutta, her PhD in comparative literature from Cornell University, her DLit from Toronto, DLit from the University of London in 2003. She has served as distinguished professor at a whole range of universities. It is not possible for me to list all of them here. Brown University, Stanford University, University of California, Irvine, Pittsburgh, Emory, and so on. She has 12 honorary doctorate degrees from a whole range of universities again, and again, not possible to list all 12 of them. The range can be guessed, from Presidency University to the University of Ghana, Yale University, and Paris University, and so on. She has been the recipient of Kyoto Prize in Thought and Ethics in 2012, Padma Bhushan in 2013, Lifetime Scholarly Achievement Award by Modern Language Association of America 2018. Her first book, appropriately titled Myself Must I Remake, and the subtitle of the book was Life and Poetry of W.B. Yeats. It came out in 1974. Soon after, within a gap of 2 years, her next book of Grammatology, which is a translation with critical introduction of Jacques Derrida's book, came out in 1976. The impact of that translation and critical introduction has been huge. Professor Spivak has been deeply invested in questions of language, cultural politics, translation, and gender. And her works have reshaped the contours of the fields of colonial studies, post-colonial studies, gender studies, and culture studies. Though it is not possible for me to give a complete list of her rich and influential output in a short time that I have, I will name a few titles. In Other Worlds, Essays in Cultural Politics, Outside the Teaching Machine, which came out in 1993, Imaginary Maps and Breast Stories. These 2 books came out in 1994 and 1997, respectively. They are translations with critical introduction of stories of Mahashweta Devi and very popular with students taught in Indian universities and the universities world over. Her book, A Critique of Post-Colonial Reason Towards a History of the Vanishing Present, came out in 1999. Her book, Death of a Discipline, another very significant book, came out in 2003. Other Asias 2003, on aesthetic education, which came out in 2013, and readings came out in 2014. In a way, I mean, as the titles of these books are self-explanatory, Professor Spivak has given us the grammar to think with and from our location. Her eloquent and uncompromising essay, Can the Subaltern Speak, has become a worldwide classic. It is, it is given to our students as they enter their college year. It's like a Bible to read. Uh, Today, I'm really, really glad and delighted and honored that she is with us today. As Eliot said, in my beginning is my end. The title of her talk today, Who Wants to Learn Languages, promises to possibly take us back to the basics of the questions with which we began this seminar. So without much ado, over to you, Professor Spivak. Thank you for taking out time, for being so kind to us throughout your email interactions. Thank you so much, and a very warm welcome to you. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nishat, for that very generous introduction. I, in fact, am very grateful to Professor Najma Akhtar and you, and Kashish Dua and Meenakshi Yadav for inviting me to present this valedictory address. It's not, as you just said, beginning and end. A valedictory address is not just valedictory, it's vale atque ave. It's also for the next one, right? So that's the spirit in which I will speak. And I will speak in the name of my mother, Shibani Chakravorty, who took an MA in Bengali vernacular at the University of Calcutta in 1937. You have the words public spheres at the end of your title, the conference title, and I want to focus a little bit on that. In my mother's time, of course, there was no public sphere as we have, because the public sphere is the sphere of citizenship. And for them, it was the sphere of subjectship. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But I speak also in the name of my father, Paresh Chandra Chakravorty, who was born in a village where they did not wear clothes until they were 6 or 7 years old. They wore just a gunshi, a metal band around their middle, and and when they went to school, they wore a little dhoti, but they had to put the dhoti on their heads because they had to swim to school quite often near the Brahmaputra, way north in Mymensingh. Now, I used to call my father died in 1955. I used to call my father Maimonides, remembering the great Jewish philosopher, Musa ibn Maimun, Arab Jewish philosopher, because his English name is, of course, the son of Maimun, Moses Maimonides. And my father was born in Mymensingh, Muminsha. So therefore, I used to call him affectionately Maimonides, my father. Now, he did not take, you see, he was from a very poor family, and he was going to be taken. Surya, I wonder, did you get the photos of my mother's family?
I didn't know.
Anyway, so my mother's family was a well-established family in Calcutta. And my father was going to be made into what is called a ghorjamai in Bengali by my grandfather. My father, in fact, refused in 1928 to take a dowry and become a ghorjamai. This is a very important thing. He was a poor man. And so from that point of view, I remember my father's gift of spirit. My father died, my father destroyed his career. He became the youngest civil surgeon in Dhaka. He destroyed his career at the age of 42 because in 2 seconds he refused to give false evidence to protect a rapist who was a friend of the British government, who was his employers. So in 3 seconds, he destroyed his career and came back. So this, I speak, and they brought us up as completely secular, completely anti-casteist, and totally lovingly for our Islamic culture in the east of Bengal. So this is the heritage which I have tried in a very weak way to carry forward, and so therefore I speak in their name, and I will give to you the question that I have asked my students. I became a tenure track assistant professor in the fall of 1965 when I was 23 years old. So I've taught for a very, very long time. And because of my upbringing, my rearing, the question that I have always asked my students, some of whom, of course, were older than I, my oldest students were born in the 30s, I have always ask for whom is it useful? For whom is it useful? In other words, what is the next step from preservation? For whom is preservation useful? You know, so therefore, I ask what to do with preservation. And I would say that to an extent, Ganesh Devi, whom I know very, very well, at a certain time, in fact, when Mahashitadi was alive, I worked some with Ganesh. I would like to say that my work is to supplement, our work is to supplement Devi's work in producing the People's Linguistic Survey of India. You know, these, when he talks about the persons with whom he works in India, I would like to say, you know, they're very sweet words. He says, I give this to you with affection. I give them to you with affection. They are people whom I don't know. They're people who do not know anything about digitalization. They're people who do not know anything about Grierson. They're people who do not know anything about grammar. But I give this to India with affection. I ask the question, where is the India that will take it? Who is being, why should they remain in that with the affection of not knowing anything, bus drivers, taxi drivers, and so on? In the public sphere, do we not have an obligation towards them? So I would like to say what I said to some French folks just last week when they asked me questions about political theory. I would like to say, where possible, the largest sectors of the electorate must be approached in a very hands-on intensive way. Now, these bus drivers and so on should not just be our sources and should not just be approached with affection. I think what Ganesh is doing is fantastic, fantastic. But unless it is supplemented, and what is it to supplement? Let me move on. So I said to the French, they must be approached in a very hands-on intensive way for movement from feudal loyalties and convictions, because that's where they are. I speak from personal experience. In a very hands-on intensive way to movement from feudal loyalties and convictions to democratic intuitions. Why? Because they vote. They don't just give us information for collection and preservation. They vote. So and what are democratic intuitions in my understanding? Autonomy and equality for me and my group, as well as other groups, unlike us, to actually do this with people who have nothing, people unlike us. Believe me, it's a very, very hard task. And unless we supplement all our preservation and collection with this we should not use the words public sphere. The public sphere is the sphere of citizenship. So I believe that otherwise we are, this is what I said to the French, we are at best looking forward to a democratic world ruled by tyrants, where democracy is nothing but body count, democracy as arithmetic, patigonit. I say this to the untouchables I work with. গণতন্ত্র পাটিগণিত নয়. This is something that you can share with the very poor, because they vote and they are used to keep tyrants all over the world because of class apartheid in education. We do not just collect them and preserve them and treat them with affection so that we can praise ourselves. This is not our task. Is a very hard task at which we do not succeed. Vanguardist policy at promoting class consciousness among the masses. I quote, of course, the mechanical Marxist point of view. I remain a Marxist, but this vanguardist policy at promoting class consciousness among the masses and organizing labor have not succeeded as policies. So unfortunately, this other way is the only way in which, with persistence, we might secure something like a general will for social justice. So I would say, unless we supplement, and supplementing, what is supplementing? It is to recognize that something is not total. This, in this case, supplementing, collecting, and preserving. It's not total, that you have to come in, you have to add, but you also have to criticize at the same time, constructively, and you have to introduce the incalculable, which is the diversity among peoples. All people are equal, but not the same. This is something that absolutely must be remembered. This is the next step from preservation. And I would like to refer, for example, to the wonderful passage from Tana Trivedi, wonderful passage, who spoke about Sudesh Mishra, a contemporary fourth generation Fijian, Indian, Australian poet, who chronicles the memories of ancestral trauma associated with indenture and settlement of Indians in Fiji through language. I totally sympathize. Maurice Condé invited me. I was the only Indian citizen there, to Guadeloupe in 2004 to celebrate the 1854 boat that took indentured labor, 884 of them, to Guadeloupe. They were so low down that they could not be called Indians. They were called Hindustanis. And they were there, and I apologized to them. But in spite of this Fiji thing where Rabindranath went, in fact, it felt like a nothing. I apologized to them, singing line by line that song, Jaboi Ami Jaboi, where in fact the idea that in those islands there were our compatriots, pretty much slaves, was completely forgotten. So I'm very happy that Tana Trivedi brought it up. But if we are talking about the public sphere, what we have to remember is also that they are haunted by radioactivity. The descendants of these islands are stateless because this was the area where the United States did nuclear testing and nothing to stop the effects of nuclear testing. Descendants of these islands today, I'm not talking about the upper class Fijians. They are stateless, separated from their ancestral burial grounds by a tempestuous ocean and imprisoned on foreign islands within a state officially named, not Fiji, the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands, created and funded by the US government. As some Marshallese have pointed out, They now have as many voting representatives at the United Nations as the United States, namely 1. We have to notice globally in a completely post-colonial world, the public sphere. Sudesh Mishra, in fact, is quite aware of this. And we should, and in fact, I was quoting Emlyn Hughes, who's a fantastic physicist who's been very active there, but now he realizes that he has to supplement his own work with approaching them, and therefore he's going to speak for us. He works with us, and his extraordinary question is the question that we should mention rather than just identity, which is, what is nuclear justice? What is nuclear justice? That is also a supplementation. This is our world. This is the public sphere. We can't just speak in terms of continentality, a little part of the continent called South Asia. We are mostly speaking about India. Pakistan is mentioned once. And so therefore, that's something that we must remember. We live in a world not on bounded continents. So I would also like to quote Ganesh's remarks about Nigeria in the list. I quote, "While these amazing exceptions do exist, it is a lived experience of people in countries like Nigeria, Mexico, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, and India that most languages are passing through the phase of a rapid depletion in domains of language transaction and word stocks." Now, I do work in Nigeria myself. I have been working for 10 or 12 years now. And what I do is work with the unsystematized mother tongues, okay? And here again, we have to get into the area of the policy making. We have to get into the area of the development lobby. See, I have this picture to show you myself in Africa as evidence. This is the palace of the Emir of Ilorin, not even one of the big places, okay? The king, the Muslim king of Ilorin, a wonderful man. He's standing in the middle. He told his people, Professor Spivak is not born a Muslim, and therefore she does not have to take off her shoes, and she does not have to cover her head. And therefore, of course, I covered my head. I took off my shoes. That is adab. Eh? So I came in, and we are 4 of us. He's a Catholic. He's dead now, Abiola Irele, like my brother. He was Francis Abiola Irele, a socialist, unbelieving Catholic, okay? There's Wole Soyinka, who is himself a kind of Igbo. He was being given an honorary doctorate by Abdul Rashid Nahalla, who's the vice chancellor, who was then, now he's in Abuja, who was vice chancellor of the Kwara State University. I had never seen him in any other clothes but so-called Muslim clothes. Wonderfully handsome guy in his wonderful Muslim clothes. Why is he wearing a 3-piece suit, smiling away, visiting his emir, wearing a 3-piece suit? Because that was convocation day at his university, to prove that it is a secular university. Therefore, the sign of secularism was, of course, the global English. And I say something about the use of English. So there he is smiling, Abdul Rashid, and there's the emir in the center. And this is my proof of my involvement with Africa. So I work with them. It's Africa-led, with the unsystematized mother tongues of Africa. And these things are not acknowledged, of course, by the development lobby. The development lobby, which comes into Africa, and now India and China are also fighting over Africa. The development lobby does not acknowledge the world's wealth of languages. So how does one do it? Not by collecting. The UN is away preserving. but by somehow speaking to not the ones who can go to Columbia, good students, careerists, but the ones who are from these small rural universities, first generation, to make them interested in learning those languages, so that, and somehow approaching the development lobby so that development workers can in fact learn on the ground the way in which these languages can be learned to work with the communities who do not speak the great languages like Yoruba and Kiswahili and so on and so forth. They might as well be English. So therefore, there again, it's a supplementation, it's a work in the public sphere. So yesterday, I was speaking to you, Nishat, about the fact that Edward Said and myself seem to have been forgotten. But I was speaking yesterday to undergraduates at Trinity College Dublin, and they forgot, as they came in, they forgot to turn off their mic, and I heard them say, "Oh, I didn't know she was still alive. I didn't know she was still alive." And I realized that, as you said, Hans, those days when I was speaking at Heidelberg at the Cluster of Excellence, those days are long gone. So what I would like, and so this, as I was saying to you, that I noticed that Edward Said and I had been forgotten, and we were not mentioned even once. And I think it was because we were troublemakers. And I would, in fact, like, with great affection, I would like to address Arindam Shah from Qazi Nazrul University. I have a feeling that he's probably cross with me because there was that confrontation with the student at Qazi Nazrul who felt that I was trying to tell him not to come into New York University, whereas I had myself, of course, I mean, he doesn't, of course, know that I went on a life mortgage on borrowed money. And so because I had no money and I had to leave because I had been so critical of Calcutta University as at 18 years of age as the editor of Presidency College magazine. This text is available, very easily available, 1960. That Taraknath Singh told me, "You're not about to get a first class in your MA." And at that stage, all I knew, since my dad was long dead, I was supporting myself. 4, 5 coachings, 5 tuitions. All I knew was that I had to leave because I wouldn't even get a passport if I don't get a first class in the 5-year plans at that point. So therefore, I borrowed money from an unknown person because I couldn't tell my mom that I was about to leave in the middle of my MA. On my head, life mortgage. I don't think life mortgages existed at that time. But, what did I know? And so in the second year, when I was 20 years old, since at that time, I was not a native, this was before Lyndon Johnson changed the Alien Registration Act, right? After which the 500% brain drain from Asia. But at that point, this is 1961 I'm talking about, I was not given any kind of aid because my native language was not English. So therefore, at the age of 20, no visa, no money, no work permit, about to be deported. Who knows these stories? Because I don't think I should tell these stories. I have succeeded. So therefore, but I do want to say to Arindam Shah that he should forget his anger on that occasion. And so he should, he mentions David Damrosch, who in fact himself, his proposal builds on Pascal Casanova and Franco Moretti, both of whom I knew well. Franco, of course, despised me. And he said once that he would not be in any committee meeting where I was a member, okay? So Franco Moretti's interventions on rewording existing templates of world literature. And he talks about David Damrosch and Feng Chia and so on. Now, David has argued for in his new book on comparative, comparing literatures, He has said, comparatists have long played a central role in the import-export trade in literary theory, but as theoretical perspectives take hold in many different venues, does the discipline still have a distinctive identity and purpose? And then he mentions Velek, Deman, and Spivak and Sosi as people who held up the old idea of comparative literature. Now, Orindam, if you are going to mention Damrosch in your writing, you can say what you like about how arrogant I am and how nasty I was. But this is not a personal issue. As a scholar, you should acknowledge this. David has just asked me to give the Poggioli lecture at Harvard, which I'm going to give, in fact, on the 19th, all right? So therefore, you do not want to write in this way, erasing out the person from your area who in fact worked very hard. It was part of my arrogance comes from the fact that when we were doing this work, we had to compete with white guys. I was the only woman and the only person of color at my first job at the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm not university professor of English, by the way. I'm university professor of the humanities. So that is something I speak for the humanities beyond the disciplines as a weapon. So therefore, I say to Orindam with the greatest affection that when you are actually doing your professional work, do not let your personal hostilities interfere with what you're doing. So at any rate, and this is why, in fact, I mentioned Gramsci, and I said that we must look at the fact that Gramsci says himself that, Surya, were you able to get the Gramsci passage? Hey, Surya.
Yeah, it should be there as the next one.
It's the next one? Okay. I must really, I mean, without Surya, I don't know. Okay. Historical grammar cannot but be comparative, writes Gramsci. An expression that, analyzed thoroughly, Gramsci writes, indicates the deep-seated awareness that the linguistic fact, like any other historical fact, cannot have strictly defined national boundaries, but that history is always world history, and that particular histories exist only within world history. Normative grammar always presupposes choice, a cultural tendency, and is thus always an act of national cultural politics. Today, in our public sphere, there are two things that one notes. One of them is, of course, Islamophobia, and the other is the disappearance of Urdu as a language. It does not have, in fact, a place. It's not the national language of Pakistan, just as Bengali is not just the national language of Bangladesh. Language cannot be mapped. Language doesn't belong to places. So therefore, the idea that you have to actually think about national cultural politics when you do any kind of historical work, that is why, because, as I was reading Arindam Shah, it came to me that, you must realize that you're doing something here which is much bigger than personal animosity, as an existing arrogance. Without a certain kind of arrogance, you think we could have soldiered on at that point with a BA from the University of Calcutta? When, even in as university professor, now there is another one, Saidia Hartman, which is very nice. But I'm a ranking person in that department, right? Sitting at admissions committee meeting, someone whom I won't name, you know her, she is saying, not Gauri, it's a white American. She's saying that Gauri is a wonderful person, a very good colleague. So she's saying, well, will this student from Nashville be able to manage at Columbia? After all, she's not from. And I then spoke up and I said, remember who is the ranking person sitting in this room? He is from the University of Calcutta, not even a US university. What are you talking about? This is why, by the way, in '87, at JNU, I was the guy in literature, I forget his name, he spoke against my visiting professorship. If Romila Thapar had not been my friend, I was brought in through the history department. So remember that this national cultural politics is a very important thing. You have to forget, and you have to remember Gramsci. And therefore, in order to do what we must do, we must use what we have. And therefore, I will, in fact, go with Javid, what is his name now? Javed Majid, who wrote about beyond hegemonic binaries and asked us to recognize that English is, after all, an Indian language. And I have written in readings, which you didn't mention, which was a collection of lectures that I gave in Pune. I told them, look, accept, because you use what you have, you turn it around. It's called affirmative sabotage. You turn it around to use it against its own goals. You accept the fact that here we are, English department, all speaking in English, that against its own intentions, unintended consequence, English established a certain kind of borderlessness. Use that to establish a comparative literature of Indian languages. This is in my published book, Readings, addressed to Indians, whereas Death of a Discipline is addressed to the United States. So to an extent, this is something, I mean, English, the creolization of English. We talk about Take Back the Night. Excuse me for giving you a line of Creole. Monkey, donkey, fox and ox, mouse, rat and cat, rat, barano, kal, pachadal, cadaverous bad. This is a serious song against night violence in Calcutta. Bengali Creole, lexicalized English. So to an extent, this opposition to English is a Eurocentric position, a binary opposition. English is an Indian language among all the others. And we should use it because as a consequence of colonialism, it created a borderlessness. I mean, you should hear English spoken, which of course you can say, oh, grammatical mistake. No, sir. If it's understood, it's our English. So this is why, for example, I like the journal Frontier, because it's a very useful left of the left journal from where I get ideas every time I read it. And I was, in fact, very fortunate to have the friendship of the founding editor, Shamor Sen, of whom even Indira Gandhi was afraid he didn't go underground during the emergency. Now, they write in Indian English. They do not try to somehow turn it, mind you, on the web, I suppose, people mock them. But Indian English is not there to be mocked. It is our English. So to an extent, to be able to acknowledge this. So but remember, Javed, why can Javed Majid say this? Because he has a DPhil from Oxford. He teaches at King's College. So to an extent, use the ones who have gained some privilege, use the privilege in order to be able to acknowledge the English as a Creole. So in fact, Grierson, Ganesh is not against Grierson. He does say that in Grierson's report, he found out how many languages were dying. But old Grierson, Shuniti Chattopadhyay wrote a thing for him, wrote a dissertation for him. He was Shuniti Chattopadhyay's dissertation father. And that gave a book, it's a huge book, which we refer to in Bengal reverently only by the initials, ODB. Everybody, every intellectual knows what ODB is. Origin and development, ODBL, origin and development of the Bengali language. Dissertation written for Grierson. And old Grierson, you know, he did metaphysical poetry, etc. Who knows what he was like? So to an extent, you must also think of him as not just a global English, etc. So therefore, you know, the way I think about Vidyasagar, very different from people like Bhudev Mukherjee, who actually rose in their careers with the British government. But Vidyasagar, actually, during Macaulay's report, he was a teenager, a village boy, who acknowledged that Macaulay, unfortunately, was correct at that point. We had gone nowhere. Complicity. So what did he do? He wrote primers that I use in the villages. There was an article about a primer from someone from Calcutta University in order to get that Borno Parichai, the primer. He had to go to the India Office Library in London. They're on sale in these villages. We use them as textbooks because they are, mind you, the Paschim Bango Shikha Parishad has ruined them by realizing that they do not need pictures. They need to have the alphabet exactly as it is, and then the alphabet changed so that you don't just memorize them. That's a teaching text, Varna Parichai. That's still useful. So that's what Vidyasagar did. He wrote a grammar which was not just Panini, Bakaran Kaumudi. That's what I learned Sanskrit from. He wrote primers, Bodhodaya, all of these things. Bodhodaya, the emergence of understanding by acknowledging that Macaulay unfortunately was correct at that point, and not just saying, oh, identity, bad man. No. And he was so disappointed with the fact that nobody wanted to do what I have just talked about, hands-on with the lowest, that at the end of his life, he went off to Karmatar, lived with Santals, and that's how he died. So therefore, you have to realize that one must use what one has. When I teach my Dalits students at the on the border of Jharkhand, they don't know any English at all. What do I teach them? I tell them, look at our wonderful language, Bengali. Look at our wonderful alphabet. Look how beautifully, and of course, not from the books that are available from the Shikha Parishad, but from Vidyasagar's book. I say to them, look how beautifully it's organized by sound. Kachatatapa, kachatatapa, gajadadaba, gajadadaba. And then all of the things together, all of the nasals, wanyananama. And then come the outside of the borders. I don't even know what the borders are called in English, but at any rate, because I'm not a linguist, but I share this with them. And then I say, but do you see what's happened? We don't even use these. You can't even say Shah. We don't use these things. They're useless. So why did English win? Look at this. Only 26 letters. So many sounds. Even vowels, Sharavarna, that we don't have. We only have O, A, O, O. English has I, long. It has the long E, Dirgho A. We don't have that. Short A. And how do they do it? By putting one letter there and one letter here. So in fact, they think English is another Bengali, because Bengali, of course, is the only language, right? So they learn to love English because they learn Bengali. Language, you don't look at the language as evil. It is something that I said this to the Chinese when I was learning Chinese. And I've quoted this. The guy says to me, managing directors, WTO. Well, yes, you speak English well, because I was asked, would I teach them some English? He says, you speak well because you are, the British had their boots on your neck. You speak English well. And I said, look, the WTO has its boot on your neck now. So you're asking me how to teach how to learn English. How did we defeat the English? By learning to love English. I love English, English poetry as much, and I'm learning Chinese as I have been for the last 12 years because I want to be able to read Chinese poetry someday. So therefore, it's the loving, just deciding English is bad. We all talk in English. I think it's immediate bad faith. We are all in an English department. Immediate bad faith. You can't do anything good by not acknowledging your own complicity. So when I teach them English, I go like this, and then, with that thing about that I said, they are from Devi. They're not aware of the international phonetic apparatus. They do not know what grammar is. They have never heard of Panini and Bhattacharya or of Saussure, Sapir, and Chomsky. Most of them were not aware of a great colonial scholar called George Abraham Grierson. I post it here with affection. And then that's what I want to create the problem solvers. I want to create the desire for learning languages, not just preserve the languages, not just my language, but all kinds of languages. So when I speak to the students, I try to teach them what we must all learn, that the public sphere is run by greed. So I say to them, lobhe labh. I mean, I ask them, I say to them, myself and my co-worker, Anirban Bhattaji, who I hope is in the audience, he's a wonderful guy. I wish I could talk a little bit about him. We have money, so we can be morally outraged, I say to them. But it is this is in Bengali, of course. But it is understandable that you, who have never had money, and now through being educated, you can make money and want money. You see, educated by our work now for since 1998, since I was kicked out of Purulia. It is understandable that you, who have never had money, and now through being educated, you can make money and want money. You cannot be faulted. But you do know the proverb, lobhe paap, pape mrityu. Sin is in greed, death in sin. Sin in greed, death in sin. Yes? Yes, they say. So should we stop being greedy? Yes, they say. No, say I. We would fail. I'm greedy too. I like money. Complicity. Let me rewrite the proverb for you. Lobhe labh, eker labhe oneker mrityu. Profit in greed. One person's profit brings death to money. Keep what you need, but use the rest for greater good. This is socialism. Keep what you need, but use the rest for greater good. Will for social justice. One person's profit brings death to many. So this idea, one of our guys there, the smartest among them, who was chosen by CPM to run for the Panchayat elections, could not file his nomination papers because the party in power threatened to harm his family. He has taken a bank loan, bought a printer, basically running an ATM for the local illiterates under COVID, and running an online business in makeup. He has never seen a plane, never seen an airport. And in fact, my best teacher has never been on a train, okay? Most of my students have never seen trains because it's 45 kilometers from these villages. How will they go there? So therefore, I have to keep working with this guy because he's greedy too. There's a lot of caste prejudice among the untouchables. You have to be there in order to earn their trust, not just collect them. I have no anthropological interest here. And you teach them English as the old Arab translators, when they were translating Aristotle. You think Ibn Rushd thought Aristotle was a foreign language? No. He made Greek his language and then intervened. Very different kind of training from Aquinas, Christianized Aristotle, said Charlemagne. Now therefore, this is the way to go with, now I believe I've used up my time and more, right? So do you want me to stop? I will just mention, I'll say what I was going to say. I was going to talk about the Rohingyas because their language is not being preserved by anyone. It's not understandable, and they're totally stateless. I was going to talk about them. I was going to talk about Sabiha Hassami, and I was going to really, really agree with her. And I was going to say that since I work there, we call those languages, they call them Moitili. I don't even know. Bhojpuri is a language in Mauritius, as you know, not a dialect. But Moitili, they call them Moitili when they're talking in that peculiar kind of Hindi and Bengali mixed up. But there is another language.
Professor Spivak, maybe we can carry on this discussion in the Q&A session, if that's all right with you.
Yes, but let me just mention these two or three things. One of them is Panch Parganaya, which Hassami and I may be able to talk about together, which is spoken there. Panch Parganaya, I would have talked about the Kayasts at Adha Musalman, my sister, because someone does mention, Hashami does mention Kayasts and Muslims together, as they should, not allowed Urdu as a first language. And then I would have gone down to the old Pali canon of the Buddha, Richard Gombrich, and I would have ended with Baburnama, talking to Waqas Ahmed about the Chagtai Baburnama, destroyed by glorification into a wonderful imperial text. And the Chagtai grammar is now available. Now, I'm sorry I've spoken too long, but I didn't have the time to organize a talk because I was talking to Trinity yesterday. So in fact, maybe you would like to see I'm wearing my night clothes under my shawl. So because I didn't have the time to change. So at any rate, go for it. Question and answer. Ask me good questions, okay? So I'm instructed. This is the best time for me.
Okay, we'll try our best. We'll try our best. Maybe I can come in at this point. I'm Hans Harder, and I'm supposed to sum up what you've just said. Now, you've taken us full circle through so many topics, and there's also a whole would-be dimension to what you would have said if you had the time for that. But let me try to pick maybe 2 or 3 points and then ask you a question before I open the larger platform for everybody. So you've taken us from the public sphere as citizenship to democracy beyond party politics, to unsystemized mother tongues, which I found very significant, and the disappearance of Urdu and the borderlessness of languages, right? And then also this sabotage attitude towards English, complicity, very important. And Lobhelab was also something I took away from what you said. This was a good reformulation of something. But one word I didn't hear in what you said, and this is one of the words we have in the title of our conference. We had in the title of our conference, that's the term vernacular, right? So we've been trying to chew on this category of the vernacular for 3 days now. And it's a category, I guess, none of us is particularly fond of, but then it remains contested enough to trigger 3 days of discussion, no matter whether or not you deem it useful. So vernacularity, I think, we all think after these debates and deliberations, vernacular has so many meanings. And the 2 most prominent, perhaps, are the spoken language of the house. In that sense, sociolinguists, I think, also use the term. And the other, in present-day usage, would be a collective shorthand for South Asian languages that are not English. And well, when discussing this term of the vernacular, we found that it is decidedly not a subaltern category in any sense, but rather a middling category. Or let us say it's middle class, perhaps lower middle class in this language hierarchy. Despite all its relation of dependency vis-a-vis English, it still marks a status, and it has things below it, things that aren't considered even as languages, things that strive for vernacular status. So if you permit, I would like to push you a little bit into this direction, and I would love to hear from you what you think about this the class belongings of the vernacular.
Fantastic summary, by the way. My stuff is summarized constantly, obviously, but this was very useful. May I also take two questions from the floor so that since
Of course. So then I would pass over to our to Grace
Professor
Mariam
Harder,
Raju
yeah.
and Abhishek Pundir, right? Who will take some of the questions from
Yes,
the chat box, which is already full.
Right.
Yes.
I think that Aunt Herda was obliged to give a narrative of my summary and then ask the question. But here, I think, in order for me to give very long answers, keep the questions brief. Don't make them narratives. Okay.
Okay. And I'll try and briefly summarize all the questions for you. So the first question is from Abhishek. He asks, talks about the notions of public sphere. He talks about the notion of public sphere being limited to a literate class, having access to ideas vis-a-vis printed material, journals, and magazines. How shall one take into account the scattered public sphere, even in case of North India?
Mm.
So he's referring to the elitism that's already there in the discourse.
Okay.
Then the next question is from Professor Nishad Zaidi. She asks, does the process of vernacularization function in a sustained manner in a scenario of world languages today? Does it have linkages with the manner in which vernacularization was carried in colonial times?
Okay. So shall I approach these three?
Yes,
Okay.
and then I'll offer more.
Yes, yes. So Hans, really, thank you very much for, and thanks for liking Lobhe Labh. Don't forget the next part. Aker labhe oneker mrityu. Okay, that's important. So, and then the next one, keep what you have, break even, take a little, spend the rest for the good of others. That's socialism in a formula. So socialism, and I also say to them, পুঁজি ভালো, পুঁজিবাদ খারাপ. So this is socialism. Socialism is not romantic anti-capitalism. So it's affirmative sabotage of the theft of surplus value. By consent, I steal my own surplus value for the good of others. Socialism. Anyway, so thank you for liking that. Vernacular. I did in fact mention it. That's why I spoke in the name of my mother, knowing that you folks had already discussed it. I said, I speak in the name of my mother, Shivani Chakravorty, who took an MA in Bengali vernacular at the University of Calcutta in 1937. And I tried to compress all of this in there. And I said there was no citizenship public sphere in her time. There's vernacular. So that's where I began. But I'm glad you brought it up. You see, no, they're not subaltern. You're absolutely right. What do we do with the languages below? That's where I was talking about using privilege. And you notice that affirmative sabotage, using privilege to turn it around. You will notice that those who talk about preserving what is below vernaculars are themselves, in fact, able to do it because they are elite educated. Tara Shankar Bandyopadhyay could write Hashulibaker Upakatha about the Kahars because he was himself an MA in regular English. So that to an extent, to the idea of producing problem solvers, this is a very harsh thing to say, I almost feel with my students who, like I say, they play with broken bricks. Their grandfathers take them away from the schools because they must do some bagali for others, looking after goats and cows so that they can, at 8 and 6 and 7, to make some money. So these people, you can't, I say to myself, we were destroyed, and then we started talking about preserving culture because globalization requires that ideology now, that we will all become identitarians. We were destroyed first, and then we are now top-down philanthropy toward what's below vernacular. Let them be destroyed, and let them emerge as talking about what is below. Let me at least teach them to look below rather than preserve them. So therefore, I have a very practical, this is how I've lived my life. This is what I've been doing since 1984. I mean, I've been teaching abroad since 1965, so that's longer. But nonetheless, this is how I try to approach that practically. It's all very well, as they said to Amartya Sen Spratici, I quote, "Boro boro kotha bola soja." And in English, one says, talk the talk, walk the walk. So all this talk about what to do for the languages below, I have a very practical approach. History is what hurts. And we have come out of that hurt, the enabling violation of colonialism, speaking in English to each other about protecting what's below the vernaculars. So let's not be in bad faith. Let's acknowledge complicity, and let's realize that sometimes the practical choice for those of us who have had privilege is to be destructive and acknowledge that that's all that's left for us. Just talking about protecting people who have no follow-up, who are punished for what we do to them, and then walk away. And I could tell you a long story of, it's there in Righting Wrongs. And that thing is, that first victory for the tribals in Calcutta High Court is still not finished. It's still not finished. So therefore, that's my unhappy answer. And this unhappiness I carry on my shoulders, which is why I don't finish my books. And so the public sphere, now Abhishek, public Abhishek or Abhijit? Abhishek, okay. The public sphere is not limited to an elite class. That's where I began. The largest sector of the electorate exercising the responsibility of citizenship without any of the rights. That's the subaltern, by the way, withdrawn from the new subaltern. When Gramsci wrote, Gramsci's definition I use, social groups in the margins of history. That's the title of book 25. But I use that. But Gramsci didn't know about this business, the subalternization of citizenship by just taking their vote. That is the public sphere. It's elitist to say that only learned people are in the public sphere. That's where I began. We have to learn how the hell to approach the mindset of people whose cognitive machinery has been destroyed. Thank God for the imagination. It's not so easy to destroy it. Even these people, I mean, you should have seen these teachers and students and supervisors talking with me about imagining the square root of 2, which is, of course, can't happen. It's something that can't happen. You should have seen how they spoke, how the imagination is still alive. I was talking to them, and my best teacher, Kakuli Mondol, who has never even been on a train, she was able, this is not something that you just do this requires all kinds of mechanisms. She was able to do that decimal, which is infinite, right? The square root of 2. And she was able to do it to the place of 23 with just pencil and paper. So the public sphere does not just belong to, that's an elitist point of view. These are the ones who are creating a tyrant-ruled world. Trump, Erdogan, how do you think, and the guy in the Philippines, how do you think these people are elected? First of all, fear and violence down below. How do I know this? Because I know the people. I know the person who was murdered. So I knew. So that therefore there's a lot of violence in Birbhum, the border of Jharkhand. But my little island, the education island where I go all the time, no violence. And they will even say to me, Didi, don't come at night, because there have been some murders all around, because who knows, they might kill me. I live in the United States. So therefore, this idea that the public sphere belongs to us is a wrong idea. That's where I began. So I would say that. And as for the scenario of vernacularization, yes, Nishat, absolutely yes. Of course, you know this. I mean, now In Algeria, for example, when I was working there with the socialist women, I had to leave, of course, when the Fonds Islamique du Salut came in 1991. And I was moving toward the Sahel with the socialist women, and I was in the polling booths during that in Wuhan, during those elections. The mother would say, Habiba's mother, je ne suis pas encore arabisée, because of course the French had kept the French stuff there. And then suddenly, as she was Arabizing herself, now it's English. So that, in fact, people in Vietnam, for example, say now, first it was French, then it was Russian, then it was Vietnamese, and now it's English. We don't know where to go. So that, to an extent, that is a problem. And what I try to do is I try to turn it around as it is, because my words are not going to change policy. I might have conferences do not affect policy at all. This is the problem now. And especially with digitization, we have conferences coming out of our ears because they don't cost money. So, I mean, they cost some money, but not the way they used to. So therefore, the idea of just deploring vernacularization, as I say again to Hans, practically speaking, given our absolute impotence, except to talk and talk, we have to do something to turn it around. And you think about it. I can't tell you what to do. I don't know you. So therefore, that's my answer. Do we have still time to take 3 more?
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so maybe we can have the discussion later, and some people can email you their questions if that is all right with you.
You're probably not going to get long email answers from me, because my books, as I say, because I'm so involved in the teaching in these schools and going there 6-9 times a year, not staying too long so they don't just obey me, so coming and going. My Du Bois book is now 11 years late. My Gramsci edition of the women's letters that have not yet been translated into English, that one is 6 years late. And the work with Bimal Krishna Motilal that I did in 91 when he died, they're still somewhere on in little floppies. Okay, that I have one computer which still takes floppies. So therefore, writing long emails is not a thing. I can talk at length and break time limits, etc. And so it'll have to be face-to-face somehow.
Okay, I'll just take a couple of more questions and maybe you can answer them together. So this is by Vinanti Vashisht. She asks, as the public sphere is very volatile, how can a preservation of languages be carried out in it?
Okay.
And then Akmal says, can creolization always be a form of decolonization? So just these 2 questions, and then Professor Hans Harder can give his concluding remarks.
Wonderful. Okay, so the public sphere, what I was talking about is how the public sphere generalizes. Subalternity is non-generalizable. The public sphere is volatile. You have to approach that part of the public sphere where there is deep xenophobia disguised as patriotism in another way. Preservation is easy to do. Basically, I mean, even the UN preserves nonstop. And if I had spoken about the Rohingyas, I would have said that their language is not intertranslatable into Burmese, Bengali, etc. I'm quoting Thibault at the University of Chicago, who is the professor of Middle Bengali, right, and has translated a lot from Arakan stuff in the Alaul he's translated. So the thing is that in that situation, preserving is not going to do them a damn bit of good. When I worked with the Kerias in the whatchamacallit, in Purulia, there was a grammar of the Keria language in Columbia Library, and everyone was talking about Keria Bhasha, etc. There was no Keria Bhasha because I was taught Sanskrit well by converted outcast Miss Pine, wonderful Miss Nilima Pine. I was taught Sanskrit because, imagine, she's teaching Sanskrit to a Brahmin girl. I mean, this is why I can't just write colonialism away. We treated them like animals. She taught me Sanskrit really well. And so therefore, I could recognize that the Kharyas were speaking varieties of Gauriya Prakrit. And so they were amazed. I was just using Hans stress shift, consonant shift, but just by doing that, I was understanding what kala chand pan kai kai dhamo sabajai. Pan kai kai, what does that mean? Pani khe khe, drinking water. So there was, my God, Didi, you're so good, you understand Kharya language. I never told them that they were speaking varieties of Gauriya Prakrit, which I was recognizing because I knew Sanskrit, because my heart broke. This is a tragedy. So therefore, preserving is not hard. It's just that the volatility of the public sphere has to be confronted in its own terms. Xenophobia, violent xenophobia disguised as patriotism. I know it's very hard. My only citizenship is Indian. So I also speak in fear. So therefore, you have to keep that in mind. And can creolization decolonize? No, nothing can decolonize. Decolonization is a dream of class continuous people, academic class continuous people. They're decolonizing every day. It's like, look, ma, no hands. They're riding their bicycles. No, we are within globalization. The DIPSOs, the dollar income public sector, exists in the global south. We forget the north and the south with decolonizing. In fact, globalization allows this decolonization talk because it allows them to do their work carefully. Everybody who claims to decolonize because they're speaking their bhasha knows nothing about what happens in the absolute bottom, all the violence at the absolute bottom. They have to, the reason why I praise Arindam, or Anirban, because, people would come to me, we really want to help you. The guy in the Bolpur station, I teach in Dumka. Okay, come once, let me see. He's so afraid. He's sitting there in the Boidanathpur on the ground, and he's constantly talking to his mother, saying, don't be afraid, it's all right, etc. Finally, I told him, you don't think the people all around you are human? That you're telling your mother not to be afraid? What do you think these people are? They're equal to you. What are you? And so the next day he was crying, so that he was crying, and we had to take him on someone's motorbike to the station so he could go home. I never heard from him again. So that to that extent, the decolonization, these people that I teach, they've never heard of colonialism because they've never seen white people. When they saw Ben Baer, they thought he had a disease. And so the thing is that what they know is the caste system. So therefore, this idea of decolonization is a nice self-congratulatory idea, as it sometimes helps in certain kinds of European migrant situation. It does help. That's a very local, parochial European problem. That's a very different thing from this class continuous, diasporic, elite university people who are all decolonizing together by claiming a language which will not be very useful way right at the bottom. Creolization is not something that decolonized. Creolization is something that uses colonialism. That's why I sang that song. That is about night violence in Calcutta. Raat barano, kalpanchadal, monkey, donkey, fox and ox. Cadaverous bad. This is a serious song. This is not something to mock and laugh at. So therefore, creolization is affirmative sabotage of the heritage of colonialism, not decolonization at all. So therefore, and I had the courage to say this at Rhodes Must Fall at the University of Cape Town, where they had asked Achille Mbembe and Judith Butler not to speak because they felt that there was not. I went up terrified because Achille and Judith are both my friends and great thinkers. And they had been asked by the students. So I went up, but I said pretty much what I'm saying to you now. I even played a little documentary where the white Rhodesian, as it was then, white Rhodesians were speaking in the name of Cecil Rhodes. And I said, how are you different from what they're saying? I had the courage to say that. And I heard from a third person that they had said Spivak really spoke to us. So therefore, that's this decolonization stuff. I spoke in the heart of the decolonizers, the South African Oxbridge, University of Cape Town, when they were agitating and smearing shit all over the place. Rhodes must fall. So this will be my message about creolity. Creolity is affirmative sabotage of colonialism for use rather than accusation and excuse. And the final thing, Nishat, that I will say to you, the title of my book is Outside in the Teaching Machine, not outside the teaching machine. That's complicity. We have to recognize today that as we speak, we are outside in the funding machine, capitalism. So therefore, that's complicity. That's why I gave those easy formulas about socialism. It's even a fiscal desire, the desire to pay taxes, if you like, within capitalism. It's a very complicated thing. So I've taken your time because this is the only way that I can really communicate to you. Find a way of face-to-facing. I will take your time. But writing long emails full of ideas, I don't get to my own work. Thank you very, very much. I've really enjoyed myself. Wonderful questions. Thank you.
Professor Spivak, you have given us a second round of answers, and I take away another very important statement from you, which decolonization as a elite thing, as a farce, as something that doesn't really make much sense in most of the situations. That is something we definitely.
The claim to decolonization.
Yeah.
Decolonization is not a farce, no.
No, that's what I meant. Yes, I was talking about the claim of decolonization, of course. Yeah, that's another very important statement we're taking away from this discussion. And Kashish Dua said I should close. I don't feel like it, and I would like Nishat Zedi to join me and perhaps to do it herself.
No, close not in that sense, because Kashish will present the conference report before we close. But it was absolutely amazing, just as we expected Professor Spivak to listen to you. And whatever you speak from heart, from the experience that you have had in the field, and not just the bookish thing. And that's the best part of it. And I think we have a lot to learn from you. It's not an easy path, I know. But still a path that you have shown to us, and I hope that we have the courage to tread that path, maybe. So I'll pass it on to Kashish to present the conference report.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I did try to make this report a little brief, but as we know, we had some wonderful sessions, and it'll take some time, and I hope that you all will bear with us. So the Ministry of Education SPARC-supported 3-day international conference on language ideologies and the vernacular in South Asian colonial and post-colonial literatures and public spheres was organized by the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, in collaboration with South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University, Germany, from 15th March 2021 to 17th March 2021. The inaugural session of the conference opened with the welcome address of Professor Nishat Zedi, head of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and the conference chair, who spoke about how this conference, being an endeavor of academic and intellectual collaboration between the Department of English, Jamia, and South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University. Professor Zedi invited Professor Najma Akhtar, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia Islamia, to give her inaugural remarks. Professor Akhtar talked about how the online conference proposes recent formulations and debates in the status of regional languages in South Asia vis-a-vis English in the colonial and post-colonial time period. She also briefly discussed the importance of vernacular in South Asian societies and concluded by extending a hearty welcome to all the participant speakers and organizers to start the online event. This was followed by a brief introduction to the conference theme by Professor Hans Harder, Professor of Modern South Asian Languages and Literatures in the South Asia Institute at Heidelberg University and the conference international chair. He discussed how language ideologies are intimately tied with the community formation, and thus language planning, moves of standardization and purification strategies, etc. He explained how South Asian vernacular languages in colonial and post-colonial periods have come to coexist together in a close neighborhood with English. Contact with English has resulted in the modernization of language, while anti-colonial perspectives have challenged hegemonic tendencies and have led to vernacularization of English. He concluded by saying the vernacular is always related and depends on the context in which it is located. Following this was the inaugural address made by Professor G.N. Devi, author, cultural critic, and public intellectual, who focused on a historical overview of how some of the Indian languages were seen as vernacular, while others were being labeled as languages. It stretched from 4th century BC Paninian system of classification and moved on to Bhartihari's idea of language, to Matanga's description of language diversity in India. The main thrust of the lecture was upon the idea of vernacular, what constitutes a vernacular, and what does it do to a language. The keynote address was well received by the audience with pertinent questions, which was followed by a brief discussion. This was followed by a brief vote of thanks, which was delivered by Dr. Saroj Kumar Mahananda, Associate Professor Jamia and Conference Co-Chair. Next in line were the talks, the plenary talks by Professor Charu Gupta, Professor Veena Narigal, and Dr. Torsten, which was chaired by Professor Hans Harder. In this session, Professor Gupta's paper on a vernacular archive of sex and sexuality, personal annotations, reflected on how and why the vernacular has been her constitutive archive to study sex and sexuality in colonial India. She questioned the authority and authenticity of the official archive and showed how her work attempts to reframe the archive by exploring diverse histories of sexuality in vernacular imaginative texts. Professor Narigal, in her talk, Territorizing Language, Thinking the Political Through Debates Around Language, 1920 to 1960, explored the category of region as a territory, as a territorial entity around language as it emerged through the decades following the revocation of the Bengal partition. She argued that language and linguistic communities acquire a new salience as demands for political reform and responsible government precipitated debates and around territorial redistribution, constitutional norms, and distribution of franchise. The next plenary session brought together Professor Javed Majid, Professor Francesca Orsini, and was chaired by Professor Nishad Zaidi. Professor Majid, in his paper titled Beyond Hegemonic Binaries, English and the Vernaculars in Post-Liberalization India, looked at the intersection between language ideologies, economic processes, and language work. He dealt with the idea of English as lingua franca, which dominates the world today, but strategically separated the erstwhile developments in language with the key factors which have contributed to its dominance in 1945. Dr. Francesca Orsini and her paper, A Multilingual Vernacular, Krishna Sopti's Idea on Language, engaged with vernacularization and multilingualism. Professor Orsini looked at Sopti's literature and how it was a medley of various registers, making the idea of one language unattainable in any discourse or situation. The third session, chaired by Dr. Jurgen, included 3 presentations by Dr. Laila Mascarenhas and Frederick Noronha on language ideologies of a Goan desk calendar, Meenakshi Yadav on From English to Hinglish to Indic, a reflection on the evolution of digital folk cultures in India and the YouTube versus TikTok controversy, and Arindam Saha's paper Towards a Republic of Vernacular World Letters on How to Planetarize World. The first day of the conference concluded with a keynote address on the topic Lingual Estrangement, Can We Call a Language Our Own by Professor Sudipta Kaviraj. The session was jointly chaired by Professor Nishad Zaidi and Professor Hans Harder. In his lecture, Professor Kaviraj reflected on the use and function of language along with the questions of estrangement, which to him can only be addressed by language scholars and social scientists who study language in the social world. Professor Kaviraj further pointed out that when one understands language, one should not focus on the language as a category, but the very linguistic economy that operates within. The talk also brought to our attention the communicable function of language, as well as the unobvious incommunicable function of language. The main thrust of Professor Kaviraj's talk was on the mode of translationality which colonialism places us in. It was also emphasized that this translational structure, however, places individuals asymmetrically. It reaffirmed that it is important and we remind ourselves of the intellectual moral responsibility while thinking about translationality. The second day of the conference began with 3 paper presentations chaired by Dr. Suddashil Sen. In this session, papers were presented on extremely intriguing topics like Bhasha literatures in colonial and post-colonial context of India, the status of English language and its vernacularization in India, and the vernacular discourse of education in colonial India and its impact on independent India by Arifa Banu, Zarak Rice, Dr. Bushra Jabin, and Shreya Sahai, respectively. The conference then hosted plenary addresses by Professor Anjali Narlekar and Dr. Vaidik Bhattacharya, which was chaired by Professor G.J.B. Prasad. Professor Narlekar's talk on territorial reimaginings in Arun Kolatkar's poetry looked at local exchanges and the resultant intertext of the 1970s and beyond in the border areas between Marathi and Hindi writing. Dr. Narlekar examined a letter written by the Marathi poet and translator Chandrakant Patil to the Marathi Dalit modernist poet Namdev Dhasal and explored the way in which the writing worlds of Hindi and Marathi intersect and produce a different set of frames to read both literatures. Dr. Vaidik Bhattacharya's presentation on the literary sovereign, colonial histories, and the modern culture of letters argued that the modern culture of letters was largely shaped by colonial histories. Drawing on diverse material from colonial archives, his paper contended that this model of literary sovereignty was fashioned through the colonial encounter with various Indian languages and cultures, producing the central template for the modern idea of the literary as a distinct language and textual organization. Then an engaging session of presentations chaired by Professor Sumanyu Satpathy followed the plenary. This session had 3 fascinating papers on telling lives in folk tongues, reading Shanta Gokhale and Abhinita Dev Sen's autobiographical writings by Dr. Drupadi Chattopadhyay, The Ghostly Vernacular, Language in Indo-Fijian Poetry by Dr. Tanu Trivedi, and Divided Subjectivity, Minor Man and the Post-Colonial Nation, a study of Shekhar alive by Abhishek Pundir. This was followed by another presentation session where Indrani Das Gupta, Dr. Bharti Arora, and Ishita Singh presented their ideas on vernacularity in science fiction through the papers on vernacularizing science in colonial Bengal, a translational site of other archives, making Hindi modernity and Hindu science in colonial India, a reading of Devaki Nandan Khatri's Chandrakanta, and Alien Genres, Wonder, and Western Science in Colonial Hindi Science Fiction, respectively. This session was chaired by Professor Anjali Multani. Post-lunch, the attendees joined back for a thought-provoking plenary session with Dr. Margaret Purnau and Dr. Aryan Hoff as the speakers and Professor Asaduddin as the chair. Dr. Purnau began by stating how historians have offered the profound links between language and emotions, and that languages shapes emotions at 3 levels, at the level of expression, knowledge, and experience. Jazbat became the central category of talking about emotion in Hindi and Urdu since the late 19th century. The 2 central questions her paper raised were what happens to feelings when subjects move between languages, and what happens to emotions in multilingual situations in which there is no functional division between languages. Dr. Hobbs' paper traced the linguistic and cultural underpinnings behind Pakistani identity by looking closely at the linguistic demographic of Pakistan post-1947. By looking at the various debates surrounding the Pakistani identity in academic literature, the talk exposed several counter-narratives in this way. The 6th session of the second day of the conference was a paper presentation chaired by Dr. Saroj Kumar Mahananda. It consisted of presentations by Suraj Kumar Thube, Vandana Lal, and Alim Akhtar on confronting the high vernacular, non-Brahmin writings and the question of aesthetics and social exclusion in early 20th century Western India, rereading Dalit writings and translations, understanding the nexus between English language and Dalit empowerment, and the colonial and the vernacular, 3 moments of encounter, respectively. The 7th session entailed a discussion on how reverse translation alters the meaning of philosophical concepts by Professor Ruth Vanita. Chaired by Professor Harish Trivedi, the paper began with a preliminary inquiry into the impact of what Professor Vanita termed reverse translation, a phenomenon where a philosophical concept is endlessly and repeatedly translated into English, and then the English word is translated back into another Indian vernacular. In her presentation, she engaged specifically with the process through which the vernacular word and concept shifts its meaning and connotations through a process of reverse translation. The second day concluded with an exciting plenary talk by Dr. Preetha Mani titled New Voices, New Language, the Spoken Language Poetics of Tamil New Poetry. Dr. Mani's presentation explored new poetry in Tamil vis-a-vis stylistic innovations, cadences, and rhythmic sound patterns that were closely knitted in the spoken language rather than informed by the classical traditions of Tamil. She strongly asserted the cosmopolitanism of speech and vernacular against the hegemonic conventions of classical Tamil poetry. And overall, she highlighted new emerging poetics of sound as the salient feature of new poetry. The final day of the conference opened with 3 paper presentations by Dr. Swati, Nandini Kalita, and Shrikant BR. The session was chaired by Professor Anuradha Ghosh. The presentations covered novel topics like trauma and the vernacular, Sadat Hassan Manto's language games, becoming Assamese, language, identity, and anxiety, and revisiting a construct, reinventing a cosmos. This was followed by Dr. Nilesh Bose's plenary address on vernaculars across texts, modern Islam and modern literature in Bengal. In his presentation, Dr. Bose focused on how the vernacularization of Islam and the Islamicization of Bengali poetry belong to a same framework of a condition where religion and literature must be interpreted as indispensable to one another. He also drew upon Nazrul Islam's poetry and analyzed certain texts from his poetry. In doing so, he emphasized the role of the vernacular condition or vernacularization as a model for understanding religion and brought its direct relationship with literary history. The conference then hosted 2 sessions of paper presentations chaired by Professor Saugata Bhaduri and Dr. Akriti Mandwani, respectively. The third session included presentations on the location of theory, post-colonialism in North America and India by Dr. Sudhashil Sen, panning the local and global in vernacular, contemporary trends in select Malayalam fiction by Grace Mariam Raju and Rajita P. Venugopal, intensities and the limits of public sphere, mapping the emergence of public spheres in the Malayalam language through Navashakti by Ishwar Anand Thampi, and vernacular of Bihar and Bihari identity, colonial context and present times by Dr. Sabiha Hashmi. The fourth session had Professor Nishat Haider, Dr. Guntasha Tulsi, and Meenakshi Yadav, who talked about reconfiguring the vernacular, language ideologies and identity, a study of Famida Riaz's Tum Kabir, interrogating colonial historiography, traditions of vernacular, and the case of Sikh periodicals, 1900 to 1910, and the standardization and vernacularization of Hindi, respectively. The fifth session was a plenary session by Dr. Ravikant and Gautam Liu, which was chaired by Professor Rita Kothari. Dr. Ravikant, in his paper, Koi Sarhad Na Inhe Roke, Language Flows Beyond Ideological Boundaries, interweaved together a multilingual intermedia narrative about sonic neighborhoods construed within and beyond national boundaries, its chief architects being the listeners who shaped the entertainment map of South Asia by their insistent requests and persistent co-curations. While Gautam Liu, in his paper on In Defense of the Prem Sagar, reevaluating the narrative of the Hindi-Urdu split, questioned the common narrative of the divide of a common Hindi-Urdu prose at the beginning of the 19th century through a close reading of the work of Fort William's Bhasha Munshi Lalu Lal Prem Sagar. The conference concluded with the much anticipated valedictory address by Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak titled Who Wants to Learn Languages? Professor Spivak responded very patiently to all the intellectual exchange that took place over the 3 days of the conference. She also drew from her personal experience and her own position to talk about the issues of language and vernacularity. Her lecture deliberated on the conference theme through the perspective offered by Gramsci, who, as Professor Spivak argued, knew that written normative grammar always presupposes a choice, a cultural tendency, and is thus always an act of national cultural politics. She elaborated on the best way to present the choice and the tendency in order to get them accepted willingly. all 3 days of this international conference was very well attended by both students and scholars from across the globe and time zones. So that brings me to the end of the report. Thank you so much.
Well done.
Thank you, Kashish. I think we have come to a close, and before Meenakshi proposes formal vote of thanks, maybe Hans and I can say a few words. Professor Spivak, we couldn't have asked for a better valedictory address because, as you rightly said, valedictory is not the end, but it's also, opening up path for future. And your words of caution are quite important, and we'll carry it, from this conference, and we'll think about it. We'll think about all the 3 days, perhaps rethink about all the 3 days, deliberations of all the 3 days in the light of what you have said. So they're very important. And thank you for all your kindness. And, you have been so kind to us. If one only looks at the huge, formidable output, one would be scared of you. Only one needs to interact with you to know that you are such a gentle and kind person. Yes, absolutely. I mean, truly inspiring. You wouldn't believe, when I looked at, grammatology in my BA first year, when I joined Aligarh Muslim University Women's College, I was in awe of somebody like Gayatri Chakravorty, having translated Derrida. But from that point to this, it's really, really an honor. And what a journey you have covered, and what a journey you inspire in us. Thank you so much. And, I would pass it on to Hans to say a few words. But before that, yes, I must, mention my, two co-organizers, Kashish and Meenakshi, who have toiled with me very hard to make this conference possible. So treacherous to them, and, a big congratulations to them, and to Hans, who has been with me through the thick and thin of it. So thank you, Hans. Maybe you would like to say something. Please make Hans co-host. I think he was.
No, I'm on. Nishat, I can only return the compliments. And as I said before, I'm sure we wouldn't have had such a beautiful conference if you hadn't put that much effort into it. And that goes not only to you, it also goes to Kashish Dua and to Meenakshi Yadav, of course, right? You've done a really great job. I'm very happy with the way it has turned out. And today's valedictory lecture by Professor Spivak was really something very special to conclude our event. And in this spirit, I think we should perhaps close now and thank everybody for attending and for being such a lively group of, respondents, discussants.
Yes. True. I think Meenakshi will propose a formal vote of thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Hada. As we are moving towards the end of the conference, I, on behalf of the conference team, would like to express my gratitude to our Vice Chancellor, Professor Nazma Akhtar, who has always supported us in all our endeavors. We are grateful to Jamia Administration, the Office of the Registrar, for their support and quick responses to our request. We are thankful to the office staff of CIT of Jamia Millia Islamia and to the office staff of our department as well, Department of English, especially Mr. Ashok and Mr. Irfan Khan, who manage all the responsibilities with smiling faces. The success of this conference greatly owed to our rapporteurs. Without their engagement and ready support, we could not have managed the session so well. I'll just name them quickly. Grace, Abhishek, and Anab, Steven, Nida, Mirza Sadaf, Indrani, Sanya, Mehek, Ipshita, Jennifer, Sango, Zahra, Chubi, Bhavna, Sakshi, Shraddha, Ruchi, Aditi, Nabanita, Faizan. Thank you. Thanks a lot. We would like to thank our chairs and most importantly, our engaged audience who joined in from different time zones and actively participated in the discussion throughout. Without their active participation, this conference would not have been so intellectually stimulating and academically enriching as it has been. We owe huge thanks to our invited speakers, especially Professor G.N. Devi, Professor Javed Majid, Professor Francesca Orsini, Professor Sudipta Kaviraj, and also Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who by her glorious presence gave the conference a valedictory that it deserves. We are also grateful to our collaborating partners, Professor Hans Herder, South Asia Institute, Heidelberg University, Germany, and Dr. Jürgen Schaffrichner, Freie University, Berlin, who have been with us through the thick and thin of it. Finally, we would like to thank the head of the department, Jamia Millia Islamia, the conference chair, Professor Nishad Zaidi, who has been the driving force behind this conference and guided us throughout. We also like to thank our conference co-chair, Dr. Saroj Kumar Mahananda, Associate Professor at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia. I would also like to thank our technical team, Grace and Stephen, who have been with us through the entire process. I would also like to put on record my regards for MHRD Spark for granting funds for such research projects that are crucial to sustain the academic brilliance. Thank you, everyone. Thanks a lot for staying with us.
Thank you, Meenakshi, and thank you so much, Professor Spivak. We'll